now just turn to Klaas. I'm looking forward to this conversation on fusion. Dr. Hiroshi at the University of Saskatchewan helped me when I was very young, took me down to the tokamak reactor, the basement of the physics building, and provided my kind of fusion 101. And so I'm looking forward to this update and really its contribution as we continue to hear important insights. And today, I feel like we've got a front row seat. Klaas, I'll turn it to you.
First of all, thank you very much, Perry, for giving us the opportunity to speak here. I very much enjoyed the first two speakers, and I just wanted to make clear that my objective here is not to start a fusion-fission cage match, but just to show how the two can be working together, because there's an awful lot of things that are similar here, and there are a few differences that I believe make it worthwhile to invest in fusion to take it to the next step. So my name's Klaas Rodenburg. I'm the Fusion Energy Council of Canada Communication Chair. So I am by no means an expert in nuclear or fission or fusion, but have been involved with the council for the last decade or so, starting in Alberta with the Alberta Energy Council, and now going Canada-wide. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. So first of all, just kind of talk about why fusion. And I think I'm going to skip over a lot of the things that have already been said, so I don't think we have to get into a lot of it, but I will touch on a few things that have been said already. But basically, we see fusion as a safe, low carbon, unlimited source of energy. It's got the highest density of any demonstrated energy source. Its fuel source is generally available everywhere, so it's not geopolitical. Access to clean and affordable energy raises our global standard of living. And where we're probably a little bit different here is that there's fusion has no long-term radioactive waste, no meltdown risks, and no security risk, which before has really been stuck in terrorism, making sure that stuff doesn't come into the hands of the wrong people, or in war in terms of proliferation of weaponization. And now with what we've seen in Ukraine is people actually shooting at these plants. And this was not something that they were quite prepared for. Again, this has been said before in the earlier ones. We do have to look at global energy. 80% of it comes from fossil fuels, and we somehow have to bring the scenario down by reducing the amount that we use and set up. The low carbon alternatives are efficiency. You don't get emissions out of anything you don't burn. Renewables, as has been talked about already, in terms of wind, solar, and geothermal. I've added in carbon capture and utilization, and this I see as a bridging technology in terms of stopping the carbon from hitting the atmosphere in the first place. And then, of course, we've got the fission and the fusion. We've just gone through the fission, so people are pretty well aware of the benefits and how that can be done. And I'm just going to focus on the fusion and how that fits into all of this. Just an interesting slide that keeps coming up as I go through, and it's just comparing a coal-fired power plant of 1,000 megawatts and what it would take to have a comparable output from a fusion plant. And of course, the thing that always scared me was the fact that a coal-fired power plant needs about 90 rail hopper cars every day to keep it going, to keep that energy going. At the same time, it produces 30,000 tons of CO2, 600 tons of SO2, and 80 tons of NOx and those type of things, plus some other things. So it's not just the greenhouse gases that we're concerned about. In theory, a similar plant fusion plant would use about 6 pounds of deuterium, 1.8 pounds of lithium or 0.8 pounds of tritium, and would produce 2 pounds of helium and a bunch of neutrons, which is where the energy comes from in terms of where to do it. I just kind of stole this on one of our trips at the bottom here that says a cubic kilometer of seawater has enough deuterium in it to exceed the total world oil reserves. So just kind of an interesting thing to do. What is fusion? It's basically, it's the fusion of a hydrogen nuclei, very similar to the way our sun works and the stars. And of course, you want to do the marketing thing of the choice of nature and the greenest. What we're really starting to see now is the difference. There's been this big issue about, well, not an issue, but if we're getting into myths, that fusion is the fuel of the future, and it always will be. But there's been some real updates that I hope to present here that look like there'll be some form of fusion energy hitting the grid by the 2030s. Now, these may be optimistic, and it's where it sits, but I think we can really see progress here to move. So just a quick thing about how fusion works. And we're on the other side of the periodic table. Instead of the heavy elements, we're on the light elements. And it's basically, instead of splitting atoms, we're trying to fuse them together. And this would be deuterium, which is water with an extra neutron, or tritium, which is extra heavy water. Put it into, fuse it, and get the outcome of helium and the neutrons, which is where the energy comes from. You can have a look at the numbers yourself. I have no idea what they actually mean, but I'm assuming that they have been vetted and set up, because I know every time I put a number out, Alan Offenberger's all over me, making sure that all this stuff is factual and defendable. There's two main approaches. There's also some hybrid approaches now that we can start to look at. But basically, you look at magnetic, which is a way of taking the fuel cells, putting it into a stream of charged particles and keeping them in place using magnets. And that's by far right now where most of the investment is going, as well as the one thing that we're very interested in here in Alberta is the inertial, which comes where you basically talk about another driver. In particular, when you look at the National Ignition Facility in California, where they're using laser beams to smush the things together and come up with a burn. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as we go through. So on the inertial side, which is the laser side, the one that is the leading this area is the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore, California, just outside of San Francisco. And I have visited this, and they do take tours, and you can have a look at it. Very big facility, $5 to $7 billion, which in Alberta doesn't scare us in terms of the oil sands and the kind of investments being made there. But you can see on the building is that there's a football length of 192 lasers that they use. I don't know why 192 and not 190 or 193. That's what they came up with. And what it does is, if you look at the little picture of the eye, there's a 2 millimeter fuel cell. And this is what those lasers are hitting simultaneously in order to get that reaction and get that burn going. I showed again the chamber where this happens, and it's kind of cool because they used it as the what I showed in the first slide. This this was great for the movie Star Trek reboot as the engine room for the Enterprise. So, but it goes to the complexity of the fusion. And one of the things that's often quoted to me is that fission is easy to start and hard to stop, and fusion is very difficult to start but easy to stop. So this is kind of the difference between it. So I don't want to downplay the complexity of making this stuff happen, but if nothing else, at least we have these facilities to make movies on. So that goes from there. In terms of magnetic, the poster child right now is ITER, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. It's huge. It's now hit $22 billion. This may now be euros and that sort of things. It's being built in Cardache, France. It's nearing completion. So in next year or two, we should be able to get some of the first experiments out of there. And you can see the reactor that's over there. And I'm not sure if you can see the little guy standing underneath, but it's a mega project in terms of where to go. So we're truly talking both the NIF and the ITER as big science. That's really what we're looking at here. Now, progress, the NIF facility just recently, we're talking August, did a experiment which they call a shot, and it was in the zone of a completed burn. So you can see all the little shots that they've taken over the years and over time, and that curve there is the sweet zone that they're aiming for to get a burn to happen. Now, remember that this is only a burn on a single one of those little targets. So, but that's where you need to start to move forward. On the magnetic side, the JET, Joint European Torus, achieved a record fusion energy using their tokamak. And this tokamak is a smaller version of the ITER. So this is where the experiments will go that will feed the stuff for ITER as it comes online. And they ended up at 59 megajoules. And there's some, sorry, some places that they can't go too much further just because they can't go past 5 seconds and that sort of thing. But anyways, there was enough energy there to heat up 100 tea kettles. So we can make some tea now to make that go, to set it up. But again, major improvement. On the more still magnetic, but we're now starting to talk about commercial, not big institutions, big science, but smaller companies that are starting to work up. And this is the Commonwealth Fusion Systems. One of the people there is on our advisory board, and they were interested in improving the peak performance of the magnets, and they were able to get 20 Teslas, and they feel that they can bring it further. What this does is it makes for the tokamak to be smaller and still get the same performance out of it, which of course reduces the costs and the ability to commercialize. In terms of, I just took out the Canada numbers. In terms of academia, there's still, even though there's no fusion program in Canada, there's still an awful lot of work being done at the U of A, as well as the University of Saskatchewan, Toronto, Ontario Tech University, Queens, CNL for the tritium, OPG, again, for supplier of tritium fuel, and General Fusion in Burnaby, which is becoming an expert in confinement because they're actually getting enough shots there to start looking at that. It's an iterative process. So the whole idea, and I'm going to use a Canadian metaphor, is the idea is to take more shots, or more shots on the net, that I'm going to tell the Oilers tonight, is take more shots on the net so that you can score some goals. And what you can see on the right side is the eater, a huge one, the jet that we talked about earlier, and the spark, which is the Commonwealth tokamak in Boston. This is the one I just showed at the previous slide. And how, again, you could see that if you look at the spark or the CMOD, you can get a lot more shots in, because this is a much smaller tokamak, and it can be built cheaper, and it can be used more often. They haven't taken a shot in either, and they've been in construction for the last 10 years, sort of thing. So the idea is to get more shots, learn faster, and cheaper. So that brings us to a path forward in commercialization. And this is from the fusion industry to set up. There's now about 35 companies that are starting to get into, around the world, that are starting to get into fusion and are starting to come up with some things. USA is still one of the leaders, as is the UK. But as you can see there, is that private sector investments are close to 1.8 billion, and only about 80 million coming from public funding, sort of thing. To me, this is a great step forward, because it means we can move faster to do things. Same place, you can see that not everybody's into electricity generation. There are other things that you can look up as well, sort of like space propulsion, which is probably why Jeff Bezos is interested in it, medical areas, hydrogen and clean fuels, which is what Edmonton is very interested in their hub, and those type of things. Industrial heat, again, very important when you start talking steel and concrete. And you can see the investors that have been investing in there. One of the things that's interesting here is Cenovus, which is one of the Alberta oil sands companies, has invested in General Fusion, and is very well aware of this type of thing to go. Again, one of the things I like to push on, it's not just about energy. There's also, this is complex, really cool technology, and it has lots of spin-off opportunities in medical, in materials handling, in theoretical physics. You saw the batteries and that sort of thing, non-destructive testing. This thing on the route de lasers comes from the French LMJ, and it's basically the same as the National Ignition Facility. And what they did, which was kind of good, is they built an accelerator for all these new innovative products right beside the plant that they needed to put materials in. So they had a cash injection from the LMJ buying their materials, and then an opportunity to commercialize it for other industries. And where it sits, it might be a model worthwhile for us to look at. And then sort of my last slide here is just some of the enabling technologies, which I think just have other opportunities for people to be innovative and to set it up. One of the big ones that Alan Offenberg is talking about, because this is his area of expertise, is lasers and applications. But we're also talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking Amy here in Edmonton, robotics, healthcare, nanotechnologies, just consulting. We are very good at, in Canada and Alberta, at construction management and setting those things up. So really, this is what my message here is: fusion is worthwhile investing in. The more we invest, the better outcomes we're likely to have. And let's go from there. There's a whole slew of more detailed and technical stuff that we can get into in the future, but this is kind of my message today. So thank you very much to Kincaid Enterprises for allowing us to do this. Join us at the Fusion Energy There'll be more detail, more stuff that you could have a look at. And we're also planning a fusion symposium in 2023. So if anybody has some ideas, we'll get more of that information out as we go. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm, again, with the other people, more than happy to answer any questions.
Klaas, thanks very much for a deep dive into fusion. You've touched on not simply the evolution of technology, but you've also spoken about and highlighted the significance of the private sector jumping in. When we think about the urgency that Bob has mentioned, that notion of speed to market certainly again speaks to an opportunity for Canada, if not in isolation, then at least with partners to help play a leadership role in this promising area of endeavor. Conscious of our time, and I'd like to just open it up for questions. We've had an overview and then a couple of deep dives. You can see some obvious synergies between the presentations and obvious points where we need to explore a little bit more. There are other disciplines that are going to become involved, including how we frame, speak about, and ultimately act on the opportunities associated with nuclear energy. So I'm happy to see a show of hands and begin the questions and hopefully get some really interesting, insightful responses.
I'm delighted that a bunch of advances are occurring both in the fission and in the fusion space. Obviously, fission is closer to commercialization, and there was a discussion of the fear or the trust and issues that are inhibitors. In our hugely divisive world that looks for perfect solution and doesn't seem to be willing to even accept the tiniest smidgen of risk, how do we get through that? I struggle to figure out how we get through that. I welcome anybody's comments on that.
So thanks, Yogi. Look, there's so many areas where this reality of the divisive nature of public discourse, the echo chambers of social media, the loss of our ability to engage in critical thinking. We haven't yet understood how to catch up and deal with social media, for example. I think in the political sphere, that's enormously the case. And that plays to this theme of new ways of engaging and new discussions. And I actually think that what Canada's doing around Indigenous reconciliation is probably one of the greatest lessons for the world of how to try to get this right, and move forward from that. And it is also in the energy space. There's another phenomenon occurring here, Yogi, that I'd highlight, and that if you look at the history of opposition to nuclear energy, you'll say, well, Bob, here you go generalizing. I will generalize that the vocal community opposed to nuclear energy tends to share my gray hair. If you go to the students coming out of universities, the people that are inheriting the mess that we have left to them, they are open to solutions that solve the climate crisis and are prepared to look at every solution that may be there. So my sense is that learning from Indigenous reconciliation, engaging our youth by putting into our universities and our colleges and giving them the opportunity to hear what the pros and cons of various solutions are, are all going to be passed to the future. And recognizing in the meantime, we're going to have this chatter, we're going to have this he said, she said, they're wrong, he's right. It's going to be part of the discourse, and it's almost like ignoring and move beyond it. And really, it's about, I think, letting the new generation of youth come forward, the ones that are inheriting the problem, really come at this problem not with the old baggage of nuclear is bad or whatever, and come there and say, we need every solution in our toolbox that can actually solve this crisis. Am I dreaming in Technicolor? Perhaps I am. But at the end of the day, I think the climate emergency can be a global unifying message if we give it a chance. And so much of this is about the youth.
You mentioned our what we've been doing with our Indigenous peoples as a template or example of what can be done well. Can you drill down just a few ideas on, add some color to that, please?
Yeah, so the one that, the area that I think we're seeing enormous progress on is that in the energy sector, and this is right across, whether it's wind, solar, renewables, whether it's hydro, whether it's nuclear, we are actually approaching our Indigenous rights holders as equity holders in solutions that give them economic opportunity and voice at the table. In fact, votes at the table. And it's not therefore this mindset that we've got Indigenous communities, they've got, energy insecurity. What are we doing to support them? They actually have strengths. They're business people. They have abilities to be part of the energy transition. They want to be. They're going to make their own choices of which technologies they favor. But I think this is an enormous positive. And we're seeing that change in attitude towards our Indigenous peoples as business peoples, as rights holders, as equity holders. And I think this plays well to the future.
You noted a very interesting dichotomy of the role of the regulatory bodies in ensuring safety and effectiveness. But that doesn't seem to be applying in the nuclear sector, meaning industry needs to step into to make the argument and to provide the leadership, to educate the public, to engage in the reconciliation processes. Why is government not playing a leadership role?
Well, so first off, I will make the observation. What I'm talking about is we've gotten to where we are through a whole lot of historical journey that the rest of the world has also followed, that nuclear carries risks and we can't trust the industry to do it themselves. We need to regulate it. And that's the reality. And I think it's time we came back and had that conversation about a regulatory system that actually more tracks the public health reality here, Perry. That to me is a very profound discussion to have. Those of you connected with oil and gas would know about how Canada's energy regulator has struggled in this space. And I, for one, think we need more of a discussion where the public good around energy decision making is looked at through a larger lens than the safety lens. That would be extremely helpful, I think. Now, yes, Rob made the comment, there's not a more complicated system of federalism than Canada. I mean, who decides on energy projects? A number of hands go up immediately. I decide. Well, the reality is every project seems to have a whole gaggle of decision makers. It would seem to me some way of providing frameworks where engagement with stakeholders and consultations and pulling the oars in the same direction would be extremely beneficial. And my view is that one of the greatest things we could get out of Canada, if we can make SMRs work in Canadian jurisdiction, they can work anywhere in the world.
in our decarbonization series over and over and over again, regulatory reform, a new view of the institutional roles in these dialogues came up, as if technology is moving so fast that the government's institutional structures are unable to keep up, to fulfill the regulatory role. When technology moves as fast as it is, I'm not surprised at the slow rate at which democracy arrives at decisions is being confronted by the rapid rate of change. There are places in the world that have simply given up, like China, saying, look, the party knows best, you just be compliant, follow us, we'll set the regulation without consultation. But that's not our system. And our challenge is how to engage in reconciliation when things are moving so quickly.
One thing with the regulator, which I've been quite pleased with, is they've done these, they have 10 reactor vendors, small modular reactors. They are now undergoing a sort of pre-review of their technology. And this is a good step forward. So they're not providing all the details and going forward with the final design and now waiting for a couple of years for the whole review to go forward. They're doing these preliminary reviews. And so the CNSC is able to say, you need to work more on this area. You know, this is important. You need to cover this more and more experiments perhaps, or technology development in that area. And I thought that was a really good move on their part, that they aren't ready to, none of these vendors are ready to present their license case to the CNSC, but they're not going in blind, so to speak. They are now able to present, when they are ready for that, they are able to present a design with which the CNSC is already somewhat familiar. So I thought that was a very good move on their part.
I agree with Bob, is that it's coming down to trust, and there's a lack of it. And I really like the term that he used, meaningful consultation. We don't seem to be able to sit down and actually have meaningful confrontation, because if I'm right and you're wrong, sort of thing. And just as science is very much that way now, is that people expect perfect from science, is that this is the solution that will solve everything, where in fact, science is not about solutions, but about questions and getting that up. And I've really been enjoying some of the Brian Cox podcasts, and he's a physicist that is responsible for the UK's communication of science, and this whole idea that, you know, science is about changing your mind, coming up with better things, coming up, but people, and again, I don't want to generalize, but the loud people seem to not be able to understand this, that changing your mind and coming up with a better one is a good thing.
Axel, I don't see your hand, but I gather that you want to make a comment or have a question.
I was going to ask a technical question, but since we're since we're on trust, let me just make a comment. The trust in matters, in all types of matters nuclear, has been largely impaired by events outside Canada. It's been impaired by Three Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, etc. So whatever we do in the nuclear field, we have to recognize that what we do inside the country is only a partial response to building trust. We have to engage with others outside the country. I think early on, Bob was saying that the attitudes of people with gray hair or no hair, and I call myself, to nuclear is different from younger people. And I asked myself, why is that so? It's likely so because people with gray or no hair have actually experienced in Canada, albeit at a distance, real problems with nuclear. And younger people have not yet. Now, hopefully there won't be another incident anywhere in the world to impair that trust. But I think we just have to be mindful of the fact that in today's age, trust is built not only inside your own country and what you do inside your own country, but also what happens outside the country and how that is then interpreted. So the nuclear community in the global sense has a joint responsibility for advancing, explaining, and engaging with people everywhere. So it'd be interesting to know, to hear from our speakers what they think about the international dimension of building trust and how that's reflected inside Canada.
In the nuclear industry, there is a saying: a nuclear accident anywhere is a nuclear accident everywhere. One of the innovations that occurred after Chernobyl is what's called the World Association of Nuclear Operators. And every operating plant, all 400 plus operating plants of nuclear plants around the world, are members. And the requirement there is to have a safety record that far exceeds requirements of regulators. And I, as a president of ACL, have experienced the finger in the chest critique by WANO peer reviews coming into facilities at Chalk River to say, your safety standards aren't where they need to be. Here's what you need to do. It's also the theme here. And it's the reality is trust isn't an input, it's an output. And it's the consequences of those experiences. And I expect a part of it is that if you've lived TMI and Chernobyl and Fukushima, that you're colored by this. Part of the problem we have here is coming back and understanding just what transpired in those accidents and trying to understand what the implications of them were versus what the media and the anti-nuclear community has portrayed them as. If one looks at the criterion that would occur in any other industry, such as fatalities caused by the incident, then by any standard, these were not the accidents that, in terms of loss of life, they had enormous economic disruption. Certainly Fukushima in Japan, but the reality is we lose sight immediately when you talk of Fukushima that 15,000 Japanese died from the tidal waves, including failures of a number of hydro dams, and nobody died from radiation. But so it is about, and this plays back to perception, it plays back to social media, it's who you trust that you're getting your information from. My head hurts. I'm not a social scientist, but boy, do I spend a lot of time listening to social scientists. Thank you, Axel.
The Canadian Gas Association and what was formerly called the Canadian Electricity Association, now called Electricity Canada, have requested the convention of a national, federal, provincial, and territorial task force on reducing regulatory legislative barriers to getting to net zero. So those are two large players, the power sector and the natural gas sector, production, transmission, distribution in both. And I'm sure they'd be open to hearing from the nuclear sector, because obviously nuclear could be part of that solution set, either fission or fusion or both.
Just a comment, actually, going back with nuclear safety is my own subset of specialty. That's what I work with every day, is something called severe accidents, which involve accidents like TMI, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And actually, a lot of people don't seem to realize that Canada was #1 with having a severe accident at the River site, December 12, 1952. And we had quite a serious accident. It didn't cause any fatalities or any injuries whatsoever. When the reactor actually went over power, about 3 times over power in a few seconds. It was rapidly shut down. That was the end of the accident. There was cleanup after that. And we learned a great deal from that in 1952. The reactor was completely rebuilt. I remain absolutely amazed that from the time of the accident until restart was 14 months. Right now, we couldn't even get the draft safety report out in 14 months on what happened. It's interesting, though, that that accident happened and it didn't have any huge effects, produced some waste products, which we are still dealing with some of that legacy today. But that reactor accident taught us a great deal. That fellow I showed you, George Lawrence, who did that early work in Canada, he actually became the head of the Atomic Energy Control Board, which was the predecessor of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And he was very keen on learning from that accident that we would have separated shutdown systems and multiple ways of stopping the fission process. And that actually put, it really stuck a finger to our chest, so to speak, as an industry in Canada, that we learned from that. And so actually we learned less perhaps from 3 Mile Island than we might have otherwise with that accident. However, one thing I think of often is that if that accident happened today, that, in Canada, that could be perceived as the end of the nuclear industry in Canada, kind of thing, because of the way our society has changed its views on things. As someone pointed out, we are so paranoid about things, absolute safety we want, even though that's a fiction. And if we had that NRX accident today, it could be the end of at least the R&D side of nuclear in Canada, because people would have such a bad perception of it, even though the accident itself was relatively small, much smaller than TMI and the other big severe accidents we've seen in the world.
Rob, I'll give you the license or the latitude to make any summary comments, and then I'll introduce where we're headed with our next webinar.
Perry, thanks very much. I think the conversation about trust is one that social scientists are paying a lot more attention to, but so are engineers, so are chemists, so are epidemiologists. We're seeing that it isn't an on-off switch. There are high trust, medium trust, and low trust institutions, entities, countries, political cultures. And we have a mighty challenge in front of us where we would live in a relatively high trust society with high trust institutions being exposed through social media at a constant flow of events occurring in low trust countries and institutions. And it's very difficult for us to really make sense of that. And we can think about questions that are going to be raised around not the first Chernobyl, but the shelling and the incidents that have occurred during the Russian invasion. We've got our work cut out. And I think that question about trust is, I think it's prescient about being able to deploy and employ future technologies. And we've had them highlighted to here today. It's less about technology, and it is far more about that social license, or a term I prefer, social contract. And Bob, you really helped us visualize one of the challenges in the deliberations, and that is there's a gap, structural gap, where proponents need to make the case, and we need more analysis like that to say, let's make sure there's a level playing field. Let's make sure there are entities and institutions within our high trust society that can help us to have very, very clear delineations on risk mitigation, and ultimately rewards. Because the path forward, if we think about the climate and carbon conundrum that we're into, it's not going to make sense in a risk-averse or risk-free environment. So I've just appreciated the opportunity to participate today, and most especially to learn.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you all for joining us today. Axel, I will once again credit you for having set this up with your comments, concluding the last webinar of the impact of the war on Canada and energy. But I also have to go back to, I think it was Mark Summers during the decarbonization series, who was pointing out at that time that our communications in the world today have become hyper emotional. And the presentation of facts gets caught up in things like conspiracy theory and misinformation. And in a world where 5 billion people seem to have the confidence that they're going to get heard, has changed the world from one where you dealt with cohorts or groups, and you could say, I can please all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time. You can never please anybody all the time anymore. So I say thank you all to what we've done this season. And I want to note that our next webinar on May 19th is focused on leadership, restoring trust in the face of relentless chaos. And this covers literally everything we've done this year, whether it was climate change, nuclear, the war, the forces and sources of change all seem to be confronting this fact that where is the leadership that will give people a sense of trust and confidence that they can believe in, that they will be listened to. And Bob, I'd like to talk to you offline a little bit further, a couple of your slides, because it seems to be you've given some pretty deep thought to this as it relates to nuclear. But my takeaway or my feed to you is this is a lot broader and it is not unique to nuclear. This is a fundamental problem of society.